We go to the United States negotiating table with a strong hand. We don't go with a weak hand. And our endowments, as you correctly say, is exactly what we take to the table. And the ability on our part to have those products processed here. But we obviously, in doing so, want to take it a step further. And we want to be able, and that's what we are insisting on, that even as we may well want to export the critical minerals, we want them to leave the shores of South Africa as finished products so that we beneficiate what we will finally sell to them. So that is the type of discussion that we are having with them. And in a way, it is double-pronged. We negotiate with the United States, but at the same time, we encourage our companies to use this as an opportunity to start seeking out other markets. The 600 US companies that are doing business in South Africa employ many people, and it is the interests of these many people that we as a government have to take care of before we engage in a war that may not yield the results that we want. So if one wants to play to the gallery, one could embark on the type of option that Honorable Malema is talking about without knowing what outcome that option will have.
The effect of losing the master service agreement with SASSA could place the bank at risk of insolvency and possibly going under liquidation.
The Post Bank has not yet fully met the conditions for a banking license, particularly around its card key management processes and the compliance with the prudential standards that are required. Its immediate challenge is to strengthen its governance to ensure compliance with prudential standards and to stabilize its own finances. Capitalization of the bank will be considered, as it must, once the Post Bank is granted authorization to operate as a bank.
The DA argued that the president's national dialogue idea is a failure.
Mr. President, the national dialogue is a failure no matter how you sell it.
Let us give this whole process a chance, an opportunity to progress rather than stand on the sidelines and criticize. And as they say, it's better to be inside the tent rather than to be outside and doing something inside the tent.
South Africa has drawn a line, and Washington is not pleased. In recent weeks, lawmakers in the United States have openly warned of economic retaliation against Africa's most industrialized nation. Trade privileges, investment flows, and long-standing diplomatic understandings are now being questioned, all because Pretoria refuses to bend on choices. This is not just another diplomatic disagreement. It is a confrontation over power, influence, and the future shape of global economics. At the heart of the dispute lies a deeper shift: South Africa's growing independence in trade, energy, and foreign policy, and a West that is no longer used to being told no. From Congress floors in Washington to boardrooms in Johannesburg, the stakes are enormous. Billions of dollars in trade are on the line. Jobs, supply chains, and political alliances hang in the balance. And behind the scenes, other African nations are watching closely. Is this the moment South Africa finally breaks free from Western economic pressure? Or does the threat of retaliation expose how fragile Africa-US relations have become? Tonight, we examine what triggered the backlash, why South Africa is refusing to retreat, and how this standoff could reshape global power far beyond the continent. South Africa is once again at the center of a growing geopolitical confrontation. one that reflects far more than a bilateral disagreement and instead exposes deeper shifts in the global balance of power. As lawmakers in the United States warn of potential economic retaliation, Pretoria is signaling that it will not be pressured into abandoning its independent foreign and economic policies. What is unfolding is not a sudden crisis, but the culmination of years of strategic divergence, changing alliances, and rising tensions between a long-standing Western power and an increasingly assertive African state. At the heart of the dispute lies a question that has become increasingly relevant across the global South. How much autonomy can emerging economies exercise in a world still shaped by Western financial and political influence? South Africa's answer appears increasingly clear. Officials in Pretoria insist that national interests, sovereignty, and economic diversification will not be compromised, even in the face of pressure from Washington. The latest warning from US lawmakers follows months of escalating criticism over South Africa's foreign policy choices, trade relationships, and diplomatic posture. Members of the US Congress have accused South Africa of undermining Western interests through closer engagement with rivals such as China and Russia, as well as through its participation in multilateral blocs that seek to reduce dependence on Western-dominated financial systems. In Washington, the tone has hardened. Some lawmakers are now openly discussing the possibility of revisiting trade privileges, investment frameworks, and development partnerships that have long underpinned US-South Africa relations. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, commonly known as AGOA, has emerged as a focal point. For more than 2 decades, AGOA has provided South African exporters with preferential access to the US market, supporting billions of dollars in trade and tens of thousands of jobs. Critics in the United States argue that South Africa can no longer expect the benefits of such arrangements while pursuing policies that, in their view, conflict with American strategic priorities. They point to South Africa's refusal to align fully with Western positions on global conflicts, its growing trade with China, and its participation in initiatives aimed at reforming global financial governance. South African officials reject the accusation that their country is acting against the United States. Instead, they frame their position as one of principled non-alignment and economic pragmatism. Pretoria maintains that it seeks constructive relations with all major powers, including the US, Europe, China, and emerging economies, without being drawn into zero-sum geopolitical rivalries. This stance reflects South Africa's historical experience. Emerging from decades of apartheid under heavy international pressure and sanctions, the country has long been sensitive to external attempts at coercion. Many within South Africa's political establishment view economic threats not merely as policy tools, but as echoes of a past in which sovereignty was constrained by foreign interests. The current confrontation is also shaped by broader global trends. The rise of multipolarity, the expansion of South-South trade, and the growing influence of blocs such as BRICS have altered the strategic environment. South Africa's role as a founding member of BRICS has placed it firmly within a network of countries seeking to reform international institutions and reduce reliance on Western-dominated systems. For US lawmakers, this shift is unsettling. Washington has long regarded South Africa as a strategic partner in Africa, not only because of its economic weight but also because of its political influence across the continent. South Africa's positions often resonate beyond its borders, shaping debates within the African Union and influencing how other countries approach relations with the West. Economic stakes are significant on both sides. The United States remains one of South Africa's major trading partners, particularly in sectors such as automotive manufacturing, agriculture, and mining. American companies have invested billions of dollars in South Africa, drawn by its relatively developed infrastructure, financial markets, and industrial base. At the same time, South Africa has diversified its economic relationships. China is now its largest trading partner, absorbing vast quantities of minerals, manufactured goods, and agricultural products. Trade with India, the Middle East, and other African countries has also expanded, reducing reliance on any single market. This diversification gives South Africa leverage, but it does not eliminate vulnerability. Losing preferential access to the US market would have real consequences for certain industries, particularly automotive exports that depend heavily on American demand. Job losses and reduced investment could follow, at least in the short term. Yet South African leaders appear prepared to absorb such risks. They argue that long-term economic resilience depends on diversification and industrial upgrading, not on dependence on any single external partner. In public statements, officials have emphasized that South Africa is not seeking confrontation, but neither will it accept conditions that undermine its policy independence. The dispute has also reignited debate within South Africa itself. Business groups, trade unions, and opposition parties are divided. Some warn that alienating the United States could damage growth prospects and investor confidence at a time when the economy is already under strain from energy shortages, high unemployment, and fiscal pressures. Others argue that standing firm is essential. They contend that yielding to external pressure would set a dangerous precedent and limit South Africa's ability to pursue development strategies tailored to its own needs. For these voices, the current moment represents a test of whether South Africa can truly act as a sovereign player in a competitive global system. International observers see the standoff as emblematic of a wider recalibration of relations between Western powers and Africa. Across the continent, governments are increasingly willing to challenge traditional partners, negotiate harder terms, and explore alternatives. From resource nationalism to infrastructure finance, African states are asserting greater control over their economic futures. In Washington, there is growing recognition that old assumptions may no longer hold. Policymakers face a dilemma: apply pressure in the hope of enforcing alignment, or adapt to a world in which influence must be earned through partnership rather than leverage. Economic retaliation risks pushing South Africa further toward alternative alliances, potentially accelerating the very shift US lawmakers seek to prevent. Diplomatically, both sides have left room for dialogue. US officials emphasize that no final decisions have been made, and that discussions are ongoing. South African diplomats continue to engage with their American counterparts, stressing shared interests in trade, security, and regional stability. Behind closed doors, there is an awareness that escalation carries risks. For the United States, weakening ties with South Africa could reduce its influence in Africa at a time when competition with China and other powers is intensifying. For South Africa, a prolonged dispute could complicate efforts to attract investment and stabilize an economy facing significant challenges. The coming months will be critical. Reviews of trade frameworks, congressional hearings, and diplomatic exchanges will shape the trajectory of the relationship. Much will depend on whether both sides can find a balance between principle and pragmatism, between strategic interests and mutual respect. What is clear is that the era of unquestioned Western dominance in shaping global economic relationships is fading. South Africa's response to US pressure reflects a broader assertion of agency among emerging economies. The outcome of this standoff will not only affect bilateral ties, but may also signal how power is negotiated in a more fragmented, multipolar world. For now, South Africa is standing firm. It is betting that resilience, diversification, and strategic autonomy will provide greater security than compliance under pressure. Whether that calculation proves correct will depend not only on decisions in Pretoria, but also on how Washington chooses to respond in a world where influence is increasingly contested.